Well, thank you for that very warm reception. It is good to see you here. What a wonderful 2 days we've had, hearing from our candidates and how good a job they're doing conveying the principles of republicanism. You know, June 2nd, 1979 is not a date that you'll find in many history books. In fact, it's not a date that many at the time thought was significant, but it was significant nonetheless. June 2nd, 1979 marked the day that Pope John Paul II traveled into his homeland, his country of Poland, and he began a series of sermons over several days where he conveyed to his people, his former countrymen, to them as it relates to you're not who they say you are. Let me remind you who you are. When you look at what Pope John Paul II did, starting June 2nd, 1979, he went to his people to remind them that the communication, the system of government the communists represented was not who they were as a people. And he encouraged them to think beyond the current struggles that they faced in June of 1979. 10 years later, many historians would say, that date marked the date that solidarity began in Poland, and it led to the fall of communism a decade later because of the truth that Pope John Paul II communicated to his people at that time. If I were to say to you that we live in a significant time in history, that we are facing challenges in this nation at this time that are similar to that, I think it's very important for us to understand that we are in fact living a very important time in history. A time in history where rule of law is under attack. We are living a time where there is a reimagining of fundamental liberties that we count dear. You know, as the Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma, that we have led coalitions across this country to respond to this president's overreach as it relates to those fundamental principles and rule of law. We began with our challenge with the Affordable Care Act, where this president, many months after the law was passed and after the decision in June of 2012, disregarded the state's decisions. Every state in the country had a decision to make on whether to set up a state health care exchange. The state of Oklahoma joined with 36 other states to say no to the state health care exchange, and it was the right decision. But when the state of Oklahoma said no, when 36 other states said no, the administration had a problem. Because under the Affordable Care Act, the president was trying to use subsidies as an incentive to encourage states to set up the exchanges. And so when 37 states said no, they could not issue the subsidies, but they also couldn't do something else very importantly. They could not assess the penalties against employers and individuals in 37 states. And so the state of Oklahoma, in September of 2012, responded to the illegal, unlawful action of the IRS that disregarded the state's decision. And we sued the IRS in September of 2012. And we said that there's something more fundamental than even these issues around the Affordable Care Act, and it's called rule of law. You cannot disregard the statute. You must act according to the statute as an agent at the federal level, and you have not done so. And Oklahoma began that battle in September of 2012. March of this year, I was in the Supreme Court, where that case was being argued, those issues were being advocated. I'm looking forward to the month of June when the Supreme Court of the United States says to the 37 states across the country, you were right, the federal government was wrong, the IRS cannot do what they did, and the law is inoperable in 37 states. But this issue about health care is important. The issue about the Affordable Care Act is important. But what's more transcendent is that issue of rule of law. We have an attitude that's emanating from Washington, D.C. This president embodies it when he says, I have a pen and I have a phone. When he says that he can act in the place of Congress, or when he says that though the law says one thing, I can do another, it breaches something that is fundamental to our constitutional fabric. You know, rule of law is important because it provides stability and consistency and constancy for those that are regulated and those that are governed by the law. And it gives businesses confidence that when the law says one thing, they know that that is something that's expected of them, and they can conform their conduct. They can plan accordingly into the future. But when we have an executive branch that takes the statute as written and says, I can change it after the fact, it creates instability. It creates uncertainty. And I will say to you, as we gather together in 2015, The most pervasive problem we have in this country is the regulatory framework that says they're not tethered to Congress and trying to force that upon the states, and it's impeding our economic growth, and it's creating uncertainty, and our country is the worse for it, and we need to respond accordingly by holding this administration accountable. We expect very soon another agency at the federal level, an agency that is equally, I think, as difficult as the IRS, and that's hard to do. But this agency is on the march, the EPA, and we anticipate very soon that they're going to introduce a new rule called the Waters of the United States, where they're going to redefine what constitutes a water that governs or gives them jurisdiction. Currently, under the law, waters that are internal to our state, waters that are not navigable, that connect in an interstate commerce kind of way, the EPA does not have authority over those waters. And the EPA wants authority over those waters. And so they are proposing a rule, have proposed a rule, and are in the process of finalizing that rule that will redefine it to say that a dry creek bed in the state of Oklahoma that's been dry 90% of the year, when we have heavy rains like we've had recently, if standing water is in that dry creek bed that may connect to a water body that connects in interstate commerce, they have jurisdiction over that dry creek bed. That's what the EPA is doing. And I want you to hear, it is the most aggressive takeover of private property rights that we've ever seen from the federal government in history. And we as a state led a 16-state coalition to file comments to say that they cannot do that under the statute. They cannot change it after the fact. And the EPA has not listened so far. They have not shown any measure of humility, and they are continuing to press on. But let me assure you this. If the EPA does in fact finalize that rule, the state of Oklahoma, joined with these 15 other states and more, will stand at the front of the line to make sure the EPA is held accountable, and the EPA doesn't have jurisdiction over the waters of the state of Oklahoma beyond what the statute permits. Rule of law is under attack. It's under attack horizontally between the branches. We have an administration in Washington, D.C., that believes because Congress has not acted the way that he wants them to act, then he can pitch hint for Congress. He did so with respect to immigration. This president said to Congress, act, pass a law on naturalization, work on immigration, and because Congress has not acted, guess what the president did? He acted through executive order. He initiated executive action that disregarded the checks and balances between the branches. Oklahoma joined with 25 of the states and said to this administration, you cannot disregard the checks and balances horizontally between the judicial and executive and legislative branch. You cannot pinch hit or fill in the place of Congress. You have to enforce the law, not make the law. 26 states filed that action in the state of Texas. And as you know, we have obtained an injunction against the President of the United States to keep him from enforcing that law in 26 states. We are winning. It matters, and it preserves rule of law. These issues, whether it's the Affordable Care Act or the EPA, they affect us and affect us in our lives in a very personal way. Our founders understood that checks and balances mattered. Our founders understood that the horizontal checks and balances between the branches mattered, but also the vertical checks and balances. We know that the federal government is a government of enumerated powers. We know that the federal government is a government of limited powers. We know that because the Constitution says so. But this federal government, through regulatory action and through congressional action, has expanded its authority well beyond what the Constitution intended, and it's imposed itself upon whom? The states and individual citizens across this country. As we talk about rule of law, this isn't just some academic exercise. It's not some quaint concept from the 18th century. The founders understood that when you have rule of law and checks and balances, the constitutional framework that they birthed, ultimately what is preserved and protected is our individual freedom, our individual liberty. That's why these battles matter. It has been a tremendous time to be serving as Attorney General in the state of Oklahoma, but I've tried to give voice not only to the concerns of Oklahomans, but give voice to the concerns of most Americans to say, we must stand against that type of tyranny. We must stand against that type of oppression. We must stand against the federal government acting in a way that they're not authorized to act, because ultimately if we do not, we will be impacted for the future, and our liberties will be impeded in the future as well. We must act at this time. It is a significant time in history. But it isn't just rule of law that's under attack. We have a reimagining of fundamental liberties that are at stake right now, particularly with the First Amendment. We have a reimagining of what the First Amendment says about our religious liberty. We have many individuals across this country, unfortunately, one of whom is on the presidential ticket, on the Democrat side. She believes that the First Amendment only gives you a right of worship on Sunday and not a free exercise of religion. Many years ago, I had the pleasure of traveling to Romania in 1997. And I got a chance to spend time with pastors in that country. And I was frequenting a church one day, and as I was going through the church, I looked up on the wall, and there were pictures of pastors from the 1950s and the 1960s. And I was very confused. And so I asked the pastor that I was traveling with at the time, did you meet during the 1950s and 1960s? Did you gather on Sundays and worship? And the answer was, yes, we did. But every week that we met, there was someone in attendance from the government, and they monitored everything that we said. And if we took outside the four walls of the church what we learned inside the four walls of the church, we were arrested, prosecuted, and persecuted. Let me say to you, there are some in America today that seek to privatize our faith, to say to you that you have a right to worship on Sunday, but no more. You have a right to go to church on Sunday and worship and pray and learn and receive teaching. But if you take what you learn within the four walls of the church and you export it into the public square, if you live out your faith Monday through Saturday, there are some that believe that that is not protected in the First Amendment. Let me disabuse them of that notion. The First Amendment provides you an unequivocal right to take your faith into the public square, to speak what you believe, and we need to understand that we need to protect that today. The Constitution of the United States doesn't give us a right not to be offended. And we need to understand that we need to preserve and protect that most fundamental liberty of religious liberty. And it is under attack today. And I believe as we look into 2016, we need a presidential candidate that will stand unequivocally, unapologetically for rule of law, and stand unapologetically against a reimagining of liberties that change the history of what you and I have as protections. You know, one of my favorite movies says a lot about me. One of my favorite movies is National Treasure. And I don't know if you've watched that movie or not, but it's a movie with Nicolas Cage, and he's like an Indiana Jones, but around the Constitution and history. And as Nicolas Cage in the movie is walking through the Capitol Rotunda, at one moment in the movie, he walks by the Declaration of Independence. And he reads the words of the Declaration of Independence to his colleague. And he closes his scene with, "People don't talk that way anymore." Let me say to you, we need to talk that way once again. We need to understand that this is a significant time in history. Much like Pope John Paul, when he went into Poland in 1979, possibly could not have recognized that what he was beginning was that solidarity movement. We need to understand today that what we're about in 2015, going into this election cycle, that the trajectory of our country is being set for many years to come. This president's worldview does not fit the world. In the last 8 years, domestic policy and foreign policy are badly in shape. But I will say to you, more importantly, is the constitutional fabric of our country, the rule of law and the checks and balances. And we must embrace that full throttle and make sure that we have a presidential nominee that is able to stand toe-to-toe and convey to the American people that these issues matter, these principles matter, rule of law matters, because your freedom is at stake. And we must make sure that that happens as we go into this next election cycle. It's been an honor to serve you as your Attorney General these last 5+ years. It has been a very significant time to be serving, very consequential. And I look forward to a day in 2017 where the assault on the Constitution, the assault on rule of law, the assault on reimagining our First Amendment principles and constitutional rights, that we have a new person in the White House that respects those things very much, and we in Oklahoma will not be forced to sue the U.S. government to protect those principles. God bless you for what you mean to this country, and God bless the state of Oklahoma. Thank you.